Well, hello and welcome to your revision video on the poem Checking Out Me History by John Agard. Within this video, we are going to be looking at the plot, so what the poem is about. We're going to be thinking about three key quotes that it's essential that you know, although really you need to know more. The key context, so the context surrounding the poem. What the poet's intention, so what John Agard's intentions is with writing this poem, and links to other poems and themes, so you know what you can compare it to within your exam. And we're going to be thinking about the overall question, does education contribute to identity? Okay, so what is the poem about? So Checking Out My History, written by John Agard, is about the education system in the British colonies. Now, Agard was educated in Guiana, which is part of or at the time was part of the British colonies. And he uses the poem to challenge the teaching of white historical figures and nursery rhymes at the expense of important black historical figures who he feels would have given him a sense of identity and shaped who he was. So within each of the stanzas, Agard refers to two historical figures, one black and one white, and refutes the rationale behind the teaching only of white history. Now, all of these images you can see on this slide are of the black history that he wasn't taught in the education system. So within each of the, as you go through the poem, he will talk about what he was taught, but also what he wasn't. And all of these images he feels were important historical figures that he should have been taught and would help to shape his identity, but he wasn't. They were omitted. When analysing poetry, it's always important to have an understanding of the context of the author. So, at the top of the, first of all, at the top of the slide is a YouTube link to John Agard reading and explaining about the poem. So I would suggest that you watch this because it's really useful the way that he delivers it. Okay, so Agard was born in Guiana in 1949 and came to England in 1977. He is mixed race, so his mother's white and his father is black. A person of mixed race should not be seen as something threatening, but as something enriching. It's a really good idea. So he writes in Creole dialect, so that's his Caribbean dialect, to show his identity is strong, and it's mixed with English in the poem because he lived in two different places, in the Caribbean and in England. He uses a sing-song rhyme to ridicule or mock the British culture. So this is what this poem is all about, him mocking the idea of the British culture and why he was taught certain things within his education and other things were omitted. So it's a performance, he's a performance poet, so he uses non-conformist attitudes towards grammar and free verse to show his cultural identity, and anger with clever internal rhyme to build cohesion. So for example, there isn't any punctuation within the poem. So this is his way of showing his anger and showing his true cultural identity. Okay, so what was Agard's intention when he wrote Checking Out My History? So it was to lionise the holes in the education system in the British colonies that failed to teach about the important figures from Afro-Caribbean and indigenous history. They were forced to learn about British history at the expense of their own history, thereby preventing the development of their own identity. So the idea that they were forced to learn, so there was a lack of power, they didn't have a choice. They were told this, this is what they were learning within their curriculum, and they just had to get on with it. They didn't have a choice. So this has made him very angry. The fact that they didn't seem to value the black history enough to feel that it was worth teaching within the schools. But he also feels that it affected his identity. So he then had to find out about the black history himself. He wasn't taught it. It was something that he had to discover, to identify, to form his own identity and to find out who he was really. So before we go on and look at the poem, here are some key terms that it will be important for you to know and understand and be able to use within your writing in the exam when you are analysing the poem. So the first word we have here is Eurocentric. So this is focusing on European culture and history to the exclusion of the wider world. So implicitly suggests European culture is better. So that's what happened within his education system. So Agard, the education system in the British colonies was focusing on European culture without including any of the Caribbean culture. Okay, so it was suggesting that our culture, the white culture, is better, which obviously it isn't, but that Eurocentric is a really good word to use. And we're talking about the culture, so it's the arts, the ideals, the customs, history and social behaviour of a particular people. So the education system was following the culture of British, our British community, when actually they were in the Caribbean and it was totally different. So it comes on to the word oppression. So the extended, cruel or unfair treatment. So we could ask ourselves, was that really cruel and unfair that they were made to learn about that history at the expense of their own? The idea of colonisation, okay, so it's the practice of acquiring political control over another country, occupying it and economically exploiting it. So Britain had taken over many of the countries, so colonised them, Guyana being one of them. So they had political control over that country, and therefore they had the influence on how it was run and the education system there, etc. We've got the idea of bias, prejudiced against a person or group in an unfair way. So was there a bias against the black communities of Guyana, the Caribbean communities? How unfair do you feel it was? Agard obviously felt it was very unfair, and he was being a bias against him and his community. Okay, so before we go on to analysing the poem, it's important for you to understand the black historical figures that Agard is referring to. So the first one we have is Toussaint Louverture, who defeated the racist colonial forces and contributed to the abolition of slavery. Okay, so so getting rid of slavery. So that was quite important, particularly if you are Black Caribbean. That is a really important part of your history. Second one is Nanny de Maroon, who was a Jamaican slave who fought the UK colonial forces and became a national hero. So she escaped slavery and fled to the Blue Mountains, where she built communities for escaped slaves. Again, really important. Shaka the Zulu revolutionised African communities but never made contact with Europeans. And then Mary Seacole, who was a Jamaican nurse. So she applied to the government to go and help in the Crimean War at the same time as Florence Nightingale, but she was rejected and Florence Nightingale was allowed to go. But she went anyway. She decided to go, and she went and healed the injured. But when she returned, she had no help from the government, and she was left destitute when she came back to England. Then you've got the Caribs and the Arawaks. They were the original inhabitants of the West Indies who were killed off after Columbus discovered the island. So they were prior or pre-Columbus times, and it was obviously felt that they weren't worthy of being taught within the schools. So thinking about each of these people, when you look at the poem, think about what Agard is thinking of them, what he is portraying, what words or phrases does he use to describe them, and then how does that make you feel or make you imagine? Okay. So this is the British culture that was included within the curriculum. So this is what Agard was taught when he was at school. So 1066, so the Battle of Hastings, the takeover of the English society by the French. Dick Whittington, so the tale of the poor boy with nothing but a cat who becomes Mayor of London. So Agard, his idea is, how is it more important to learn about a fairy tale as opposed to somebody who fled slavery, for example? He learnt about Lord Nelson, which was the famous English admiral who inflicted massive defeat on the French, strengthening the empire. So that it was an English admiral. So again, he was, even though he was in Guiana, he was being taught, because it was colonised, he was being taught English historical figures. So the Battle of Waterloo in 1815. The final defeat of the French, led by Napoleon, making Britain a world superpower. So it's all about the British really deciding what they're going to learn about. And then Florence Nightingale, the famous British nurse who worked in the Crimean War, famed for innovations in hygiene. She was known as the lady with the lamp. Okay, so it's something that we learn about in school, but also they were learning about that in the Caribbean. And the whole idea of this poem is that Agard is questioning the validity of why they should be only taught the British culture and not some of the historical figures that really have shaped who he was. So it's important that you memorise and you know some of the key quotes within the poem, because in your exam you will be given a poem and you have to compare it to another one. So this might be one that you're having it, you're comparing it to, so you won't have it there, so you'll have to memorise the quotes. So at the beginning, the first stanza, he has the quote, "Bandage up me eye with me own history." So this is a really important quote for you to remember. The second quote, "Dem tell me about old King Cole was a merry old soul, but dem never tell me about Mary Seacole." So again, we've got dem, so as in them. Tell me about old King Cole, so they're teaching me about a nursery rhyme, but they didn't tell me about Mary Seacole. Remember, she was the one, like Florence Nightingale, who cared for the sick in the Crimean War. Now that was just one example. You could choose any of the other examples in every stanza of a comparison between something they were taught and something that they weren't, but Agard thinks they should have been. So you can memorise any of them. And finally, a really important one is the last line of the poem, "I carving out my identity." Remember, this poem is all about identity and the ideas of what you're taught in school and the history of how that contributes to your identity. So now we're going to quote explode and look in more detail at those three key quotes. Okay, so the first one, "Bandage up me eye with me own history."
Bandage up me eye with me own history.
So, what is it about? So this quote appears in the first stanza and immediately introduces to the reader to the theme of identity and history. Okay, and we've got our two hows. So the first one, Agard's use of the verb bandage casts doubt upon those in power. A bandage is a covering and prevents someone from seeing what is below. This metaphor highlights that he feels he has been blinded to his own identity and deliberately being held back from seeing his own history. So we've got the use of a method here. So we've got saying that bandage is a verb, okay, and thinking about when you're doing individual level words, so you're picking out, identifying words within the quote and thinking about what that means. So think about a bandage. A bandage is a covering. So is he saying that the government and the people in authority are covering up in things that he feels are important? So they're blinding him, so they're stopping him seeing his own identity. So he's held back from seeing his own history. Okay, the second how in the bottom left. So the abuse of power is clearly shown throughout this poem, as Agard lambasts the educational topic choices. He highlights the Eurocentric view that West Indian history only began with the arrival of Columbus in 1492. After all, the retelling of history depends who is telling the story. So we're talking about another theme here. So the theme of power, so abuse of power. So he is drawing attention to that fact with regards to the educational topic choices. Now remember the Eurocentric view. This is where the idea that perhaps the European culture is the best, as opposed to his West Indian history. And the arrival of Columbus, so that's when Britain discovered and took over and colonised the West Indies and the Caribbean areas. So the idea that anything before that isn't worth looking into. But the telling of history, which is very true, depends on who's telling the story, because it depends on that person, what they think is important to learn about. Okay, now our overall why. So the link between history and identity is evident throughout the poem. So the lack of education about, this is Agard, about his own cultural heroes resulted in Agard feeling the need to lionize this inadequacy. So lionize is drawing public attention to lionize this inadequacy in education with the identification of historical figures that Agard felt should be acknowledged. So he, all the way through the poem, he's drawing the reader's attention to this lack of identity because of the choices that were made of what he should learn in his education, and the choices made by British government that he shouldn't learn about his own historical figures, but he should learn about the British historical figures. Okay, second quote. Dem tell me about old King Cole was a merry old soul, but dem never tell me about Mary Seacole.
Them tell me old King Cole was a merry old soul, but them never tell me about Mary Seacole.
Okay, so this is one of the many examples of where Agard highlights what was and wasn't included in the education system in Ghana, which was colonised by Britain. Okay, our first how. So the quote starts off referring to being taught about a nursery rhyme. The inclusion of this is used to mock those in power for including this at the expense of what Agard considered an important historical figure. So it's written in Creole dialect, which highlights Agard's true identity in defiance of the British culture. So he's talking about Old King Cole was a merry old soul as a nursery rhyme that our children here in England are taught. And he is mocking the government for thinking that this would be more important than, for example, Mary Seacole. And he's using his dialect within the poem to show his defiance with his identity, the fact that he is Afro-Caribbean and he is rejecting the British culture. Okay, our second how. Agard compares the nursery rhyme to Mary Seacole, who was a Jamaican nurse who helped in the Crimean War alongside Florence Nightingale. So this was against the approval of the government, even though she helped many injured. So the repetition of the word dem is used to emphasise how Agard considers his true identity to be Afro-Caribbean whilst rejecting the British culture. So he's got that repetition, dem tell me, so dem as in them. So tell me about Old King Cole, but they never told me about Mary Seacole. Okay, so Agard's use of this comparison ridicules the government for their educational truces. So this is done in a sing-song way to commemorate Afro-Caribbean historical figures that were omitted from the curriculum. So the whole poem, even though there's a theme of anger, it doesn't come across as an angry poem. It comes across as to me certainly, as a poem that is celebrating and commemorating all the historical figures that he feels are part of his identity, and it's to draw public awareness to it. He is certainly criticising the government and their choices, but in a light-hearted way. Okay, our third quote. Now this is a really important one for you to remember.
I carving out my identity.
So Agard is finishing off the poem with this line, which encapsulates the theme of identity, a major consideration throughout the poem. It empowers the reader to consider the importance of identity within the British educational system. Okay, our first how. This violent metaphor and use of the first person pronoun I emphasises the passion and strength of feeling felt by Agard concerning his identity. Identity is something that shapes who you are as a person and defines your place in society, and the poem challenges the role education plays in this. Okay, so we've got our method, so it's a metaphor, and we're talking about the first person pronoun, the I. Okay, so to emphasize the passion and strength of feeling, so I carving out my identity. So it finishes the last line of the poem encapsulating the whole theme of identity and the idea of how education plays a part in this. So what you are taught within school shapes who you are. It's your understanding of the world and what has happened in history, and really he is questioning who it is that decides what is important. Okay, and the role that this plays, that education plays in forming people's identity. Okay, our second how. The use of the verb carve suggests it has not been easy and he has had to fight and create his own identity. He lambasts those in power for inadequacies in his education, resulting in him having to investigate and determine his own roots. So we've talked about our method, our verb, carving. So carving is you carve meat, don't you? You carve, so you cut something up, so you break it up into parts. So it suggests that it's quite hard work, and it suggests that after his education he has had to find out for himself about the historical figures that shape his past. It wasn't something that was provided for him. He had to investigate to find out where he comes from, to find out his roots. Okay, so why? So the poem pillarises some of the British history that is taught in the education system, particularly the nursery rhymes, and in contrast commemorates important figures from African and Caribbean history that were omitted from the curriculum. Agard could be challenging the reader to consider who decides what is important to learn about and consequently taught in schools. Okay, so he is making publicly fun of the British history that he's been taught, and how ridiculous is that to be teaching nursery rhymes when there's important people that should be being taught in place of that. And he is making or challenging the reader to think about what is important and the consequences of not being taught the right things, so how it can affect somebody's identity. Okay, let's have a little look at the key form and structure points of the poem. So it's written in an irregular rhyme scheme, so a sort of sing-song rhyme, probably to ridicule the Eurocentric culture. Okay, so he's using the rhyme scheme to ridicule what has been taught. So it's got mixed stanza form, so it's got some free verse to suggest he's breaking the confining rules of language. It's got a short mixed enjambment. Remember, enjambment links onto the next line. It hasn't got any punctuation throughout the whole poem. So this could be to allow the listener to interpret their poem in their own way and therefore attach their own identity to it. Or it could be his way of rejecting the oppressive authority of the British who decided what he should learn within school. So he could be rejecting the rules and regulations that punctuation brings. It's got standard font which shows the British culture, but it's got a Creole dialect, so his own dialect, to show his identity and empower a marginalised cultural narrative. So he is showing how important his identity is to him. Okay, so now we're going to have a look at how the exam will be presented with regards to your poetry. You will be given a poem and you will be asked to compare it to another one with a similar theme. So for example, with Checking Out My History, if you were asked to compare it to another poem with the theme of power, you could compare it to London. So within London, the persona walks the streets of London, commenting on the misery and poverty that he sees. He attributes this to the misuse of power by those in authority, and there's a large amount of anger in there. Equally, in Checking Out My History, Agard, as we know, lampoons the British government for their abuse of power within the education system. So the main difference between the poems is that Agard shows a solution, which is the different things that were missing from the curriculum, whereas Blake doesn't. So within London, there's a lot of corruption within the church and within the government, and the power that they have over people in London can be shown within the poverty that is there. And this is what Blake is conveying in his poem. So again, we've got power, the theme of power, in both of the poems. It's also, they could compare the theme of power to My Last Duchess. So within this, the persona talks about his past wife. The poem is an allegory representing the misuse of power, which highlights tales of violence, madness and murder. Now, the poem is about a painting of his last Duchess, and he alludes to the abuse of power that he subjected her to for having daring to look at another man. And both poems examine the effects this abuse of power has on its victims, because in My Last Duchess, the abuse of his power had the effect of she was eventually died, and in Checking Out My History, the abuse of power has the effect of Agard feeling like he has to look for his own identity. That was missing from his education. Another possible theme that you could have to compare Checking Out My History is the theme of anger. So you could compare it to War Photographer. So this poem exposes the horror of war witnessed by a war photographer. It exposes the anger felt by the photographer for the lack of or short-lived empathy of civilians and the lack of action by the media, who seemed happy to just report on the atrocities that are happening. So equally, Checking Out My History highlights Agard's anger with his experience in the education system. So we've got the war photographer's angry because he's seeing these terrible things that are happening. He's coming back, he's reporting on it, but nothing happens. And then with Checking Out My History, he's angry with his experience that he has in the education system and the control there that prevented him from learning about people in his own culture. You could also compare Checking Out My History to London. Again, there's lots of anger in this. The anger is felt by the persona, probably Blake. This can be seen in the description of the misery in the city, using repetition like marks of weakness, marks of woe. Both poems show anger at the establishments and those in power. Okay, so London, it's the government and those in power that affect the state of the city and the poverty that exists, and nothing is being done about that. And equally in Checking Out My History, it's the establishment and the government who sets the education system and the curriculum that Agard is angry about there. Another major theme through the poem Checking Out My History is the theme of identity. So you could be asked to compare this to another poem. So you could compare it to The Emigre. So within that, the persona explores her memory of a far-off city where she spent time as a child. So both poems explore a feeling of conflict over their own identity as a result of historical inadequacies. So The Emigre was because she moved to a different country, whereas in Checking Out My History, the person was denied the history that formed his identity. So The Emigre, so if you go to a different country, just naturally you lose your identity of your past place that you lived, and you link with your new place, so you have new cultures and identity. Whereas Checking Out My History, he was denied this. He didn't have a choice. He was prevented from forming his own identity because somebody in the British government made the decision that what he had to learn and what he didn't, and it was very egocentric. Okay, another poem you can compare it to loosely is Kamikaze. So within Kamikaze, a Japanese pilot turns around from his suicide mission and is rejected by his family. The idea of identity is intertwined with honour. The pilot's respect and identity from his family and friends were encapsulated within the suicide mission. So when this failed, he lost his identity as everybody shunned him on his return. This chosen loss of identity differs from the prevention of identity in Checking Out My History. So just to summarise that, the Kamikaze pilot, his whole life is about the honour of, flying this plane into his death for the cause. And because he chose not to and turned around and came back, he lost the respect of all his family and friends, and they wouldn't have anything to do with him. So he then lost his identity in life, whereas Checking Out My History, he was prevented from developing his identity because somebody decided what he had to learn within the curriculum.